What are bearing notations? Bearing notations are different ways or different formats that surveyors and navigators represent bearing. And there are two principal bearing notations. One is the quadrant bearing notation. Now, the quadrant bearing notation is a type of bearing notation where bearing is represented using the cardinal points and angles. So that's quadrant bearing notation. This is a type of bearing notations that represent bearing using cardinal points and an angle. And examples of quadrant bearing notation is north 50 degrees east, south 75 degrees west, north 45 degrees west, south 60 degrees east. So these are examples of quadrant bearing notation. Now, for this bearing notation, it has two cardinal points and then an angle. This one, two cardinal points and then an angle. This one, two cardinal points and an angle. This one, two cardinal points and an angle. Now, the first cardinal point for quadrant bearing notation represents the reference point. So the first cardinal point represents the reference point, where the second cardinal point represents the direction. The second cardinal point represents direction. So for me to draw this bearing, the first thing I must do is to draw the Cartesian. So the first thing is to draw the Cartesian. Then on the Cartesian, I locate the four cardinal points, which are the north, east, south, and west. Now, on the Cartesian, the north is always on the top. Then your right hand side, at your right hand side is the east. Under is the south. Then at your left hand side is the west. Please take note of this. After drawing the Cartesian, the north is located on top. The east is located at the right hand side. The south is located below. And the west is located at the left hand side. So this is the first thing to do. Then after doing this, the next thing is to locate the reference point of the bearing. Now, for this bearing, what is the reference point? The reference point is the first cardinal point, and that is the cardinal point north, which means the angle 50 degrees should start from this cardinal point north. So from this cardinal point north, measure 50 degrees to which direction? To the east direction. So measure 50 degrees from the cardinal point north to the cardinal point east is 90 degrees. So 50 degrees lies between the cardinal point north and east. So from the cardinal point north, measure 50 degrees. Where the 50 degrees stops, draw a line that represents the distance traveled or distance to be traveled. So this is the representation of the bearing north 50 degrees east. Then for the second bearing south 75 degrees west, the first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. Draw the Cartesian and then put the cardinal points. On top is the cardinal point north. At the right hand side is the cardinal point east. Below is the cardinal point south. At the left hand side is the cardinal point west. Next thing is to locate the reference of the bearing, the reference point of the bearing. For this bearing, the reference point is the cardinal point south, which means this angle 75 degrees must start from the cardinal point south. So this is the cardinal point south. So from this cardinal point south, measure 75 degrees to the west direction. to the west direction. I told you that the second cardinal point signifies the direction. So measure 75 degrees to the west direction. Where the 75 degrees stops, draw a line that signifies the distance traveled or distance to be traveled. So this is the representation of the bearing south 75 degrees west. So the next thing is to represent this bearing north 45 degrees west. So to represent this bearing diagrammatically, the first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. That's the first thing to do. The first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. On top is the cardinal point north. At the right hand side is the cardinal point east. Below is the cardinal point south. And at the left hand side is the cardinal point west. North 45 degrees west. This means that the reference point is at the cardinal point north. So this angle 45 degrees should start from the cardinal point north. So from the cardinal point north, measure 45 degrees to the west direction. So from the cardinal point north, measure 45 degrees to the west direction. Where the 45 degrees stops, draw a line that signifies the distance traveled. So this is the representation of the bearing north 45 degrees west. So this is the representation of the bearing north 45 degrees west. The next bearing to represent is south 60 degrees east. South 60 degrees east. So the first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. Draw the Cartesian. Then assign the cardinal points. On top is the cardinal point north. At the right hand side is the cardinal point east. Below is the cardinal point south. At the left hand side is the cardinal point west. Now what is the bearing? The bearing is south 60 degrees east. So the reference point is at the cardinal point south. So from the cardinal point south, measure 60 degrees to the east direction. So from the cardinal point south, measure angle 60 degrees to the east direction. Where the angle stops, draw a line that represents the distance traveled. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the bearing south 60 degrees east. The next bearing notation I will talk about is the azimuth bearing notation. Azimuth bearing notation is a type of bearing notation that represents bearing using angles only. Azimuth bearing notation represents bearing using angles only, but the angle must be of 3 digits. The angles must be of 3 digits. Examples of azimuth bearing notations are 60 degrees, 217 degrees, 120 degrees, 315 degrees. I told you the angle must be of 3 digits. So where the angle is not up to 3 digits, add 0 before the angle. For this one, it is 60 degrees. If the angle is 40 degrees, then it will be 40 degrees because the angle must be of 3 digits. So to represent this bearing 60 degrees, the first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. Draw the Cartesian. Then locate the cardinal points. On top is the cardinal point north. At the right hand side is the cardinal point east. Below is the cardinal point south. At the left hand side is the cardinal point west. Now for azimuth bearing notation, the reference point is always the cardinal point north. It doesn't change. Unlike the quadrant bearing notation where the reference point is the first cardinal point. So if the first cardinal point is north, then the cardinal point north is the reference point. If the first cardinal point is south, something like south 75 degrees east, then the cardinal point south is the reference point. But for azimuth bearing notation, the reference point doesn't change. The reference point is always the cardinal point north. So no matter how big the angle is, the angle must start from the cardinal point north, because the cardinal point is always the reference point for azimuth bearing. It doesn't change. So for 060 degrees, start from the cardinal point north, which is the reference point, measure 60 degrees to the clockwise direction. For azimuth bearing notation, the direction is clockwise. Never measure anti-clockwise direction. Unlike the quadrant bearing notation where the second cardinal point signifies the direction. But for azimuth bearing notation, the direction is always clockwise direction. Never measure anti-clockwise direction, no matter how big the angle is. So from the reference point north, measure 60 degrees to the clockwise direction. This is clockwise direction, while this direction is anti-clockwise. So measure 60 degrees to the clockwise direction. Where the 60 degree stops, draw a line that represents the distance traveled or distance to be traveled. So this is representation of the bearing 060 degrees. The next bearing is 217 degrees. So to represent that bearing diagrammatically, the first thing to do is to draw the Cartesian. On top is the cardinal point north. At the right hand side is the cardinal point east. Below is the cardinal point south. At the left hand side is the cardinal point west. Remember, the reference point for azimuth bearing notation is always the cardinal point north. So this angle 217 degrees must start from the cardinal point north. Another thing to note is that the angle between two cardinal points is 90 degrees. So from here to here is 90 degrees. From this point to this point, another 90 degrees, total of 180 degrees. From this point to this point, another 90 degrees, total of 270 degrees. From this point to this point, another 90 degrees, total of 360 degrees. So let me represent 217 degrees. So from the cardinal point north, I measure 217 degrees. From this point to this point is 90 degrees. Then to this point, 180 degrees. 180 degrees plus 75 degrees is 217 degrees. So 217 degrees lies between these 2 points. So from this point, I measure extra 37 degrees to make it 217 degrees. So where the 217 degrees stops, I draw a line that represents the distance traveled or the distance to be traveled. So this is the representation of the bearing 217 degrees. So remember, from this point to this point is 90 degrees. From this point to this point, another 90 degrees. So which is 180 degrees. Now it remains 37 degrees to complete 217 degrees. And 37 degrees lies between these 2 points, because from this point to this point is 90 degrees. So 37 degrees lies between these 2 points. So I measure 37 degrees, add it to the 180 degrees I've already measured to complete 217 degrees. So where the 217 degrees stops, draw a line that signifies the distance traveled.